This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Alex Patterson. From the Earth to the Moon by Jules Verne. Chapter 8. History of the Cannon. The resolutions passed at the last meeting produced a great effect out of doors. Timid people took fright at the idea of a shot weighing 20,000 pounds being launched into space. They asked what cannon could ever transmit a sufficient velocity to such a mighty mass. The minutes of the second meeting were destined triumphantly to answer such questions. The following evening the discussion was renewed. "My dear colleagues," said Barbicane, without further preamble, "the subject now before us is the construction of the engine, its length, its composition, and its weight. It is probable that we shall end by giving it gigantic dimensions, but however great may be the difficulties in the way, our mechanical genius will readily surmount them. Be good enough, then, to give me your attention, and do not hesitate to make objections at the close. I have no fear of them. The problem before us is how to communicate an initial force of 12,000 yards per second to a shell of 108 inches in diameter, weighing 20,000 pounds. Now, when a projectile is launched into space, what happens to it? It is acted upon by three independent forces: the resistance of the air, the attraction of the earth, and the force of impulsion with which it is endowed. Let us examine these three forces. The resistance of the air is of little importance. The atmosphere of the earth does not exceed 40 miles. Now, with the given rapidity, the projectile will have traversed this in 5 seconds, and the period is too brief for the resistance of the medium to be regarded otherwise than as insignificant. Proceeding, then, to the attraction of the earth, that is, the weight of the shell, we know that this weight will diminish in the inverse ratio of the square of the distance. When a body left to itself falls to the surface of the earth, it falls 5 feet in the first second, and if the same body were removed 257,542 miles further off, in other words, to the distance of the moon, its fall would be reduced to about half a line in the first second. That is almost equivalent to a state of perfect rest. Our business, then, is to overcome progressively this action of gravitation. The mode of accomplishing this is by the force of impulsion." "There is a difficulty," broke in the major. "True," replied the president, "but we will overcome that, for the force of impulsion will depend upon the length of the engine and the powder employed, the latter being limited only to the resisting power of the former. Our business, then, to-day is with the dimensions of the cannon." "Now, up to the present time," said Barbicane, "our longest guns have not exceeded 25 feet in length. We shall, therefore, astonish the world by the dimensions we shall be obliged to adopt. It must evidently be, then, a gun of great range, since the length of the piece will increase the detention of the gas accumulated behind the projectile, but there is no advantage in passing certain limitations." "Quite so," said the major. "What is the rule in such a case?" "Ordinarily, the length of a gun is 20 to 25 times the diameter of the shot, and its weight 235 to 240 that of the shot." "That is not enough!" cried J.T. Maston impetuously. "I agree with you, my good friend, and, in fact, following this proportion for a projectile 9 feet in diameter, weighing 30,000 pounds, the gun would only have a length of 225 feet and a weight of 7,200,000 pounds." "Ridiculous!" rejoined Maston. "As well take a pistol." "I think so too," replied Barbicane. "That is why I propose to quadruple that length, and to construct a gun of 900 feet." The general and the major offered some objections. Nevertheless, the proposition, actively supported by the secretary, was definitely adopted. "But," said Elphinstone, "what thickness must we give it?" "A thickness of 6 feet," replied Barbicane. "You surely don't think of mounting a mass like that upon a carriage?" asked the major. "It would be a superb idea, though," said Maston. "But impracticable," replied Barbicane. "No, I think of sinking this engine into the earth alone, binding it with hoops of wrought iron, and finally surrounding it with a thick mass of masonry of stone and cement. The piece once cast, it must be bored with great precision, so as to preclude any possible windage, so there will be no loss whatever of gas, and all the expansive force of the powder will be employed in the propulsion." "One simple question," said Elphinstone. "Is our gun to be rifled?" "No, certainly not," replied Barbicane. "We require an enormous initial velocity, and you are well aware that a shot quits a rifled gun less rapidly than it does a smooth-bore." "True," rejoined the major. The committee here adjourned for a few minutes to tea and sandwiches. On the discussion being renewed, "Gentlemen," said Barbicane, "we must now take into consideration the metal to be employed. Our cannon must be possessed of great tenacity, great hardness, be infusible by heat, indissoluble, and inoxidable by the corrosive action of acids." "There is no doubt about that," replied the major, "and as we shall have to employ an immense quantity of metal, we shall not be at a loss for choice." "Well, then," said Morgan, "I propose the best alloy hitherto known, which consists of 100 parts of copper, 12 of tin, and 6 of brass." "I admit," replied the president, "that this composition has yielded excellent results, but in the present case it would be too expensive and very difficult to work. I think, then, that we ought to adopt a material excellent in its way and low of price." "Such as cast iron?" "What is your advice, major?" "I quite agree with you," replied Elphinstone. "In fact," continued Barbicane, "cast iron costs 10 times less than bronze. It is easy to cast, it runs readily from the molds of sand, it is easy of manipulation, it is at once economical of money and of time. In addition, it is excellent as a material, and I will remember that during the war, at the siege of Atlanta, some iron guns fired 1,000 rounds at intervals of 20 minutes without injury." "Cast iron is very brittle, though," replied Morgan. "Yes, but it possesses great resistance. I will now ask our worthy secretary to calculate the weight of a cast iron gun with a bore of 9 feet and a thickness of 6 feet of metal." "In a moment," replied Maston; then, dashing off some algebraical formulae with marvelous facility, in a minute or two he declared the following result: "The cannon will weigh 68,040 tons, and at 2 cents a pound it will cost $2,510,701. Maston, the major, and the general regarded Barbicane with uneasy looks. "Well, gentlemen," replied the president, "I repeat what I said yesterday. Make yourselves easy. The millions will not be wanting." With this assurance of their president, the committee separated, after having fixed their third meeting for the following evening. Chapter 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Alex Patterson. From the Earth to the Moon by Jules Verne. Chapter 9. The Question of the Powders. There remained for consideration merely the question of powders. The public awaited with interest its final decision. The size of the projectile, the length of the cannon being settled, what would be the quantity of powder necessary to produce impulsion. It is generally asserted that gunpowder was invented in the 14th century by the monk Schwartz, who paid for his grand discovery with his life. It is, however, pretty well proved that this story ought to be ranked among the legends of the Middle Ages. Gunpowder was not invented by anyone. It was the lineal successor of the Greek fire, which, like itself, was composed of sulfur and saltpeter. Few persons are acquainted with the mechanical power of gunpowder. Now this is precisely what is necessary to be understood in order to comprehend the importance of the question submitted to the committee. A liter of gunpowder weighs about 2 pounds. During combustion it produces 400 liters of gas. This gas, on being liberated and acted upon by temperature raised to 2,400 degrees, occupies a space of 4,000 liters. Consequently, the volume of powder is to the volume of gas produced by its combustion as 1 to 4,000. One may judge, therefore, of the tremendous pressure of this gas when compressed within a space 4,000 times too confined. All this was, of course, well known to the members of the committee when they met on the following evening. The first speaker on this occasion was Major Elphinstone, who had been the director of the gunpowder factories during the war. "Gentlemen," said the distinguished chemist, "I began with some figures which will serve as the basis of our calculation. The old 24-pounder shot required for its discharge 16 pounds of powder." "You are certain of this amount?" broke in Barbicane. "Quite certain," replied the major. "The Armstrong cannon employs only 75 pounds of powder for a projectile of 800 pounds, and the Rodman Columbiad uses only 160 pounds of powder to send its half-ton shot a distance of 6 miles. These facts cannot be called in question, for I myself raised the point during the depositions taken before the Committee of Artillery." "Quite true," said the general. "Well," replied the major, "these figures go to prove that the quantity of powder is not increased with the weight of the shot. That is to say, if a 24-pounder shot requires 16 pounds of powder, in other words, if in an ordinary gun we employ a quantity of powder equal to 2/3 of the weight of the projectile, the proportion is not constant. Calculate, and you will see that in place of 333 pounds of powder, the quantity is reduced to no more than 160 pounds. "What are you aiming at?" asked the president. "If you push your theory to extremes, my dear major," said J.T. Maston, "you will get to this, that as soon as your shot becomes sufficiently heavy, you will not require any powder at all." "Our friend Maston is always at his jokes, even in serious matters," cried the major. "But let him make his mind easy. I am going presently to propose gunpowder enough to satisfy his artillerist's propensities. I only keep to statistical facts when I say that, during the war, and for the very largest guns, the weight of the powder was reduced, as the result of experience, to 1/10 part of the weight of the shot." "Perfectly correct," said Morgan, "but before deciding the quantity of powder necessary to give the impulse, I think it would be as well—" "We shall have to employ a large-grained powder," continued the major. "Its combustion is more rapid than that of a small." "No doubt about that," replied Morgan, "but it is very destructive, and ends by enlarging the bore of the pieces." "Granted, but that which is injurious to a gun destined to be performed long service is not so to our Columbiad. We shall run no danger of explosion, and it is necessary that our powder should take fire instantly in order that its mechanical effect may be complete." "We must have," said Maston, "several touch-holes, so as to fire it at different points at the same time." "Certainly," replied Elphinstone, "but that will render the working of the piece more difficult. I return, then, to my large-grained powder, which removes these difficulties. In his Columbiad charges, Rodman employed a powder as large as chestnuts, made of willow charcoal, simply dried in cast-iron pans. This powder was hard and glittering, but left no trace upon the hand, contained hydrogen and oxygen in large proportion, took fire instantaneously, and, though very destructive, did not sensibly injure the mouthpiece." Up to this point Barbicane had kept aloof from the discussion. He left the others to speak, while he himself listened. He had evidently got an idea. He now simply said, "Well, my friends, what quantity of powder do you propose?" The three members looked at one another. 200,000 pounds, at last said Morgan. 500,000, added the major. 800,000, screamed Maston. A moment of silence followed this triple proposal. It was at last broken by the president. "Gentlemen," he quietly said, "I start from this principle, that the resistance of a gun, constructed under the given conditions, is unlimited. I shall surprise our friend Maston, then, by stigmatizing his calculations as timid, and I propose to double his 800,000 pounds of powder." 1,600,000 pounds! shouted Maston, leaping from his seat. "Just so. We shall have to come, then, to my ideal of a cannon half a mile long, for you see, 1,600,000 pounds will occupy a space of about 20,000 cubic feet, and since the contents of your cannon do not exceed 54,000 cubic feet, it would be half full, and the bore will not be more than long enough for the gas to communicate to the projectile sufficient impulse. Nevertheless, said the president, I hold to that quantity of powder. Now, 1,600,000 pounds of powder will create 6,000 millions liters of gas. 6,000 millions! You quite understand? What is to be done, then? Said the general. The thing is very simple. We must reduce this enormous quantity of powder while preserving to it its mechanical power. Good, but by what means? I am going to tell you, replied Barbicane quietly. Nothing is more easy than to reduce this mass to 1/4 of its bulk. You know that curious cellular matter which constitutes the elementary tissue of vegetables? This substance is quite pure in many bodies, especially in cotton, which is nothing more than the down of the seeds of the cotton plant. Now cotton, combined with cold nitric acid, become transformed into a substance eminently soluble, combustible, and explosive. It was first discovered in 1832 by Branchon, a French chemist, who called it xylidine. In 1838, another Frenchman, Pellour, investigated its different properties, and finally, in 1846, Schobine, the professor of chemistry at Bâle, proposed its employment for purposes of war. This powder, now called pyroxyle, or fulminating cotton, is prepared with great facility by simply plunging cotton for 15 minutes in nitric acid, then washing it in water, then drying it, and it is ready for use. Nothing could be more simple, said Morgan. Moreover, pyroxyle is unaltered by moisture, a valuable property to us, inasmuch as it would take several days to charge the cannon. It ignites at 170 degrees in place of 240, and its combustion is so rapid that one may set light to it on the top of the ordinary powder without the latter having time to ignite. "Perfect!" exclaimed the major. "Only it is more expensive." "What matter?" cried J.T. Maston. "Finally, it imparts to the projectile a velocity 4 times superior to that of gunpowder. I will even add that if we mix it with 1/8 of its own weight of nitrate of potassium, its expansive force is again considerably augmented." "Will that be necessary?" asked the major. "I think not," replied Barbicane. "So then, in place of 1,600,000 pounds of powder, we shall have but 400,000 pounds of fulminating cotton; and since we can, without danger, compress 500 pounds of cotton into 27 cubic feet, the whole quantity will not occupy a height of more than 180 feet within the bore of the Columbiad. In this way the shot will have more than 700 feet of bore to traverse under a force of 6,000,000,000 liters of gas before taking its flight toward the moon." At this juncture J.T. Maston could not repress his emotion. He flung himself into the arms of his friend with the violence of a projectile, and Barbicane would have been stove in if he had not been bomb-proof. This incident terminated the third meeting of the committee. Barbicane and his bold colleagues, to whom nothing seemed impossible, had succeeded in solving the complex problems of projectile, cannon, and powder. Their plan was drawn up, and it only remained to put it into execution. "A mere matter of detail, a bagatelle," said J.T. Maston. End of Chapter 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Alex Patterson. From the Earth to the Moon by Jules Verne. Chapter 10. One Enemy versus 25 Millions of Friends. The American public took a lively interest in the smallest details of the enterprise of the Gun Club. It followed day by day the discussion of the committee. The most simple preparations for the great experiment, the questions of figures which it involved, the mechanical difficulties to be resolved, in one word, the entire plan of work, roused the popular excitement to the highest pitch. The purely scientific attraction was suddenly intensified by the following incident. We have seen what legions of admirers and friends Barbicane's project had rallied round its author. There was, however, one single individual alone in all the states of the Union who protested against the attempt of the Gun Club. He attacked it furiously on every opportunity, and human nature is such that Barbicane felt more keenly the opposition of that one man than he did the applause of all the others. He was well aware of the motive of this antipathy, the origin of this solitary enmity, the cause of its personality and old standing, and in what rivalry of self-love it had its rise. This persevering enemy the president of the Gun Club had never seen. Fortunate that it was so, for a meeting between the two men would certainly have been attended with serious consequences. This rival was a man of science, like Barbicane himself, of a fiery, daring, and violent disposition, a pure Yankee. His name was Captain Nicholl. He lived in Philadelphia. Most people are aware of the curious struggle which arose during the Federal War between the guns and armor of iron-plated ships. The result was the entire reconstruction of the navy of both the continents. As the one grew heavier, the other became thicker in proportion. The Merrimac, the Monitor, the Tennessee, and the Weehawken discharged enormous projectiles themselves, after having been armor-clad against the projectiles of the other. In fact, they did to others that which they would not they should do to them, that grand principle of immortality upon which rests the whole art of war. Now if Barbicane was a great founder of shot, Nicholl was a great forger of plates. The one cast night and day at Baltimore, the other forged day and night in Philadelphia. As soon as ever Barbicane invented a new shot, Nicholl invented a new plate. Each followed a current of ideas essentially opposed to the other. Happily for these citizens, so useful to their country, a distance of from 50 to 60 miles separated them from one another, and they had never yet met. Which of these inventors had the advantage over the other it was difficult to decide from the results obtained. By last accounts, however, it would seem that the armor plate would in the end have to give way to the shot. Nevertheless, there were competent judges who had their doubts on the point. At the last experiment the cylindrico-conical projectiles of Barbicane struck like so many pins in the Nicholl plates. On that day the Philadelphia iron forger then believed himself victorious, and could not evince contempt enough for his rival. But when the other afterward substituted for conical shot simple 600-pound shells at very moderate velocity, the captain was obliged to give in. In fact, these projectiles knocked his best metal plate to shivers. Matters were at this stage, and victory seemed to rest with the shot, when the war came to an end on the very day when Nicholl had completed a new armor plate of wrought steel. It was a masterpiece of its kind, and bid defiance to all the projectiles of the world. The captain had it conveyed to the Polygon at Washington, challenging the president of the Gun Club to break it. Barbicane, peace having been declared, declined to try the experiment. Nicholl, now furious, offered to expose his plate to the shock of any shot, solid, hollow, round, or conical, refused by the president, who did not choose to compromise his latest success. Nicholl, disgusted by this obstinacy, tried to tempt Barbicane by offering him every chance. He proposed to fix the plate within 200 yards of the gun. Barbicane still obstinate in refusal. 100 yards? Not even 75? "At 50 then," roared the captain through the newspapers. "At 25 yards, and I'll stand behind." Barbicane returned for answer that, even if Captain Nicholl would be so good as to stand in front, he would not fire any more. Nicholl could not contain himself at this reply, threw out hints of cowardice, that a man who refused to fire a cannon shot was pretty near being afraid of it, that artillerists who fight at 6 miles distance are substituting mathematical formulae for individual courage. To these insinuations Barbicane returned no answer. Perhaps he never heard of them, so absorbed was he in the calculations for his great enterprise. When his famous communication was made to the Gun Club, the captain's wrath passed all bounds. With his intense jealousy was mingled a feeling of absolute impotence. How was he to invent anything to beat this 900 feet Columbiad? What armor plate could ever resist a projectile of 30,000 pounds weight? Overwhelmed at first under this violent shock, he by and by recovered himself, and resolved to crush the proposal by weight of his arguments. He then violently attacked the laborers of the Gun Club, published a number of letters in the newspapers, endeavored to prove Barbicane ignorant of the first principles of gunnery. He maintained that it was absolutely impossible to impress upon any body whatever a velocity of 12,000 yards per second, that, even with such a velocity, a projectile of such weight could not transcend the limits of the earth's atmosphere. Further still, even regarding the velocity to be acquired, and granting it to be sufficient, the shell could not resist the pressure of the gas developed by the ignition of 1,600,000 pounds of powder, and supposing it to resist that pressure, it would be less able to support that temperature. It would melt on quitting the Columbiad, and fall back in a red-hot shower upon the heads of the imprudent spectators. Barbicane continued his work without regarding these attacks. Nicholl then took up the question in its other aspects. Without touching upon its uselessness in all points of view, he regarded the experiment as fraught with extreme danger, both to the citizens who might sanction by their presence so reprehensible a spectacle, and also to the towns in the neighborhood of this deplorable cannon. He also observed that if the projectile did not succeed in reaching its destination, a result absolutely impossible, it must inevitably fall back upon the earth, and that the shock of such a mass, multiplied by the square of its velocity, would seriously endanger every point of the globe. Under the circumstances, therefore, and without interfering with the rights of free citizens, it was a case for the intervention of the government, which ought not to endanger the safety of all for the pleasure of one individual. In spite of all his arguments, however, Captain Nicholl remained alone in his opinion. Nobody listened to him, and he did not succeed in alienating a single admirer from the president of the Gun Club. The latter did not even take the pains to refute the arguments of his rival. Nicholl, driven into his last entrenchments, and not able to fight personally in the cause, resolved to fight with money. He published, therefore, in the Richmond Enquirer a series of wagers, conceived in these terms, and on an increasing scale. Number 1, $1,000. That the necessary funds for the experiment of the Gun Club will not be forthcoming. Number 2, $2,000. that the operation of casting such a cannon of 900 feet is impracticable and cannot possibly succeed. Number 3, $3,000, that it is impossible to load the Columbiad, and that the pyroxyle will take fire spontaneously under the pressure of the projectile. Number 4, $4,000, that the Columbiad will burst at the first fire. Number 5, $5,000, that the shot will not travel farther than 6 miles, and that it will fall back again a few seconds after its discharge. It was an important sum, therefore, which the captain risked in his invincible obstinacy. He had no less than $15,000 at stake. Notwithstanding the importance of the challenge, on the 19th of May he received a sealed packet containing the following superbly laconic reply: Baltimore, October 19. Done. Barbicane. End of Chapter 10.
Chapter 11. From the Earth to the Moon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the Earth to the Moon by Jules Verne. Chapter 11. Florida and Texas. One question remained to be decided. It was necessary to choose a favorable spot for the experiment. According to the advice of the Observatory of Cambridge, the gun must be fired perpendicularly to the plane of the horizon, that is to say, toward the zenith. Now the moon does not traverse the zenith except in places situated between 0 and 28 degrees of the latitude. It became, then, necessary to determine exactly that spot on the globe where the immense Columbiad should be cast. On the 20th of October, at a general meeting of the Gun Club, Barbicane produced a magnificent map of the United States. "Gentlemen," said he, in opening the discussion, "I presume that we are all agreed that this experiment cannot and ought not to be tried anywhere but within the limits of the soil of the Union. Now, by good fortune, certain frontiers of the United States extend downward as far as the 28th parallel of the north latitude. If you will cast your eye over this map, you will see that we have at our disposal the whole of the southern portion of Texas and Florida." It was finally agreed, then, that the Columbiad must be cast on the soil of either Texas or Florida. The result, however, of this decision was to create a rivalry entirely without precedent between the different towns of these two states. The 28th parallel, on reaching the American coast, traverses the peninsula of Florida, dividing it into two nearly equal portions. Then, plunging into the Gulf of Mexico, it subtends the arc formed by Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Then, skirting Texas, off which it cuts an angle, it continues its course over Mexico, crosses the Sonora, Old California, and loses itself in the Pacific Ocean. It was, therefore, only those portions of Texas and Florida which were situated below this parallel which came within the prescribed conditions of latitude. Florida, in its southern part, reckons no cities of importance. It is simply studded with forts raised against the roving Indians. One solitary town, Tampa Town, was able to put in a claim in favor of its situation. In Texas, on the contrary, the towns are much more numerous and important. Corpus Christi in the county of Nueces, and all the cities situated on the Rio Bravo, Laredo, Carmelites, San Ignacio, the Webb, Rio Grande City of the Star, Edinburgh and Hidalgo, Santa Rita, El Panda, Brownsville, and the Cameron formed an imposing league against the pretensions of Florida. So, scarcely was the decision known, when Texas and Floridan deputies arrived at Baltimore in an incredibly short space of time. From that very moment, President Barbicane and the influential members of the Gun Club were besieged day and night by formidable claims. If 7 cities of Greece contended for the honor of having given birth to Homer, here were 2 entire states threatening to come to blows about the question of a cannon. The rival parties promenaded the streets with arms in their hands, and at every occasion of their meeting a collision was to be apprehended which might have been attended with disastrous results. Happily, the prudence and address of President Barbicane averted the danger. These personal demonstrations found a division in the newspapers of different states. The New York Herald and the Tribune supported Texas, while the Times and the American Review espoused the cause of Floridan deputies. The members of the Gun Club could not decide to which to give the preference. Texas produced its array of 26 counties. Florida replied that 12 counties were better than 26, in a country only 1/6 part of the size. Texas plumed itself upon its 330,000 natives. Florida, with a far smaller territory, boasts of being much more densely populated with 56,000. The Texas, though the columns of the Herald claimed that some regard should be had to a state which grew the best cotton in all America, produced the best green oak for service of the Navy, and contained the finest oil, besides iron mines, in which the yield was 50% of pure metal. To this, the American Review replied that the soil of Florida, although not equally rich, afforded the best conditions for the molding and casting of the Columbiad, consisting as it did of sand and argillaceous earth. That may be all very well, replied the Texans, but you must first get to this country. Now, with the communications with Florida are difficult, while the coast of Texas offers the Bay of Galveston, which produces a circumference of 14 leagues and is capable of containing the navies of the entire world. A pretty notion truly, replied the papers of interest of Florida, that of Galveston Bay below the 29th parallel. Have we not got the Bay of Espiritu Santo, opening precisely upon the 28th degree, and by which ships can reach Tampa Town by direct route? A fine bay, half choked with sand. Choke yourselves, returned the others. Thus the war went on for several days, when Florida endeavored to draw her adversary away from the fresh ground, and one morning the Times hinted that, the enterprise being essentially American, it ought not to be attempted upon other than purely American territory. To these words Texas retorted, America, are we not so much as you? Were not Texas and Florida both incorporated into the Union in 1845? Undoubtedly, replied the Times, but we have belonged to the Americans ever since 1820. Yes, returned the Tribune, after having been Spaniards or English for 200 years, you were sold to the United States for $5 million. Well, and why we need blush for that? Was not Louisiana bought from Napoleon in 1803 at the price of $16 million? Scandalous, roared the Texas deputies. A wretched little strip of country like Florida to dare to compare itself to Texas, who in place of selling herself asserted her own independence, drove out the Mexicans on March 2nd, 1846, and declared herself a federal republic after a victory gained by Samuel Houston on the banks of San Jacinto over the troops of Santa Anna, a country, in fine, which voluntarily annexed itself to the United States of America. Yes, it was afraid of the Mexicans, replied Florida. Afraid? From this moment the state of things became intolerable. A sanguinary encounter seemed daily imminent between the two parties of the streets of Baltimore. It became necessary to keep an eye upon the deputies. President Barbicane knew not which way to look. Notes, documents, letters full of menaces showered down upon his house. Which side ought he to take? As regarded the appropriation of soil, the facility of communication, the rapidity of transport, the claims of both states were evenly balanced. As for political prepossessions, they had nothing to do with the question. This deadlock had existed for some little time, when Barbicane resolved to get rid of it all at once. He called a meeting of his colleagues, and laid before them a proposition which, it will be seen, was profoundly sagacious. On carefully considering, he said, what is going on now between Florida and Texas, it is clear that the same difficulties will recur with all the towns of the favored state. The rivalry will descend from state to city, and so on downward. Now Texas possesses 11 towns within the prescribed conditions, which will further dispute the honor and create us new enemies, while Florida has only one. I go in, therefore, for Florida and Tampa Town. This decision, on being made known, utterly crushed the Texan deputies. Seized with an indescribable fury, they addressed the threatening letters to different members of the gun club by name. The magistrates had but one course to take, and they took it. They chartered a special train, forced the Texans into whether they would or not, and then quitted the city with a speed of 30 miles an hour. Quickly, however, as they were dispatched, they found time to hurl one last and bitter sarcasm at their adversaries. Alluding to the extent of Florida, a mere peninsula confined between two seas, they pretended that it would never sustain the shock of the discharge, and that it would bust up at the very first shot. Very well, let it bust up, replied the Floridans, with a brevity of the days of ancient Sparta. End of chapter 11. Recorded in Austin, Texas.
Chapter 12 of From the Earth to the Moon, This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the Earth to the Moon by Jules Verne, Chapter 12. Urbi et Orbi. The astronomical, mechanical, and topographical difficulties resolved, finally came the question of finance. The sum required was far too great for any individual, or even any single state, to provide the requisite millions. President Barbicane undertook, despite of the matter being a purely American affair, to render it one of universal interest, and to request the financial co-operation of all peoples. It was, he maintained, the right and duty of the whole earth to interfere in the affairs of its satellite. The subscription, opened at Baltimore, extended properly to the whole world. Urbi et Orbi. This subscription was successful beyond all expectation, notwithstanding that it was a question not of lending but of giving the money. It was a purely disinterested operation in the strictest sense of the term, and offered not the slightest chance of profit. The effect, however, of Barbicane's communication was not confined to the frontiers of the United States. It crossed the Atlantic and Pacific, invading simultaneously Asia and Europe, Africa and Oceanica. The observatories of the Union placed themselves in immediate communication with those of foreign countries. Some, such as those of Paris, Petersburg, Berlin, Stockholm, Hamburg, Malta, Lisbon, Benares, Madras, and others, transmitted their good wishes. The rest maintained a prudent silence, quietly awaiting the result. As for the observatory at Greenwich, seconded, as it was, by the 22 astronomical establishments of Great Britain, it spoke plainly enough. It boldly denied the possibility of success, and pronounced in favour of the theories of Captain Nicholl. But this was nothing more than mere English jealousy. On the 8th of October, President Barbicane published a manifesto full of enthusiasm, in which he made an appeal to all persons of good will upon the face of the earth. This document, translated into all languages, met with immense success. Subscription lists were opened in all the principal cities of the Union, with a central office at the Baltimore Bank, 9 Baltimore Street. In addition, subscriptions were received at the following banks in the different states of the 2 continents: at Vienna, with S.M. de Rothschild; at Petersburg, Stieglitz and Company; at Paris, the Credit Mobilier; at Stockholm, Tottie and Arfjerdson; at London, N.M. Rothschild and Son; at Turin, Ardouin and Company; at Berlin, Mendelssohn; at Geneva, Lombard, Odier and Company; at Constantinople, the Ottoman Bank; at Brussels, J. Lambert; at Madrid, Daniel Weiswiller; at Amsterdam, Netherlands Credit Company; at Rome, Torlonia and Company; at Lisbon, Lessenes; at Copenhagen, Private Bank; at Rio de Janeiro, Private Bank; at Montevideo, Private Bank; at Valparaiso and Lima, Thomas Lachambre and Company; at Mexico, Martin Daran and Company. 3 days after the manifesto of President Barbicane, $4,000,000 were paid into the different towns of the Union. With such a balance the Gun Club might begin operations at once. But some days later, advices were received to the effect that foreign subscriptions were being eagerly taken up. Certain countries distinguished themselves by their liberality; others untied their purse strings with less facility, a matter of temperament. Figures are, however, more eloquent than words, and here is the official statement of the sums which were paid in to the credit of the Gun Club at the close of the subscription. Russia paid in as her contingent the enormous sum of 368,733 roubles. No one need be surprised at this who bears in mind the scientific taste of the Russians, and the impetus which they have given to astronomical studies, thanks to their numerous observatories. France began deriding the pretensions of the Americans. The moon served as a pretext for 1,000 stale puns and a score of ballads, in which bad taste contested the palm with ignorance. But as formerly the French paid before signing, so now they paid after having had their laugh, and they subscribed for a sum of 1,253,930 francs. At that price they had a right to enjoy themselves a little. Austria showed herself generous in the midst of her financial crisis. Her public contributions amounted to the sum of 216,000 florins, a perfect godsend. 52,000 rix-dollars were the remittance of Sweden and Norway. The amount is large for the country, but it would undoubtedly have been considerably increased had the subscription been opened in Christiania simultaneously with that at Stockholm. For some reason or other the Norwegians do not like to send their money to Sweden. Prussia, by a remittance of 250,000 thalers, testified her high approval of the enterprise. Turkey behaved generously, but she had a personal interest in the matter. The moon, in fact, regulates the cycle of her years and her fast of Ramadan. She could not do less than give 1,372,640 piastres, and she gave them with an eagerness which denoted, however, some pressure on the part of the government. Belgium distinguished herself among the second-rate states by a grant of 513,000 francs, about 2 centimes per head of her population. Holland and her colonies interested themselves to the extent of 110,000 florins, only demanding an allowance of 5% discount for paying ready money. Denmark, a little contracted in territory, gave nevertheless 9,000 ducats, proving her love for scientific experiments. The Germanic Confederation pledged itself to 34,285 florins. It was impossible to ask for more; besides, they would not have given it. Though very much crippled, Italy found 200,000 lire in the pockets of her people. If she had had Venetia she would have done better, but she had not. The States of the Church thought that they could not send less than 7,040 Roman crowns, and Portugal carried her devotion to science as far as 30,000 cruzados. It was the widow's mite, 86 piastres, but self-constituted empires are always rather short of money. 257 francs. This was the modest contribution of Switzerland to the American work. One must freely admit that she did not see the practical side of the matter. It did not seem to her that the mere dispatch of a shot to the moon could possibly establish any relation of affairs with her, and it did not seem prudent to her to embark her capital in so hazardous an enterprise. After all, perhaps she was right. As to Spain, she could not scrape together more than 110 reals. She gave as an excuse that she had her railways to finish. The truth is that science is not favourably regarded in that country. It is still in a backward state, and moreover, certain Spaniards, not by any means the least educated, did not form a correct estimate of the bulk of the projectile compared with that of the moon. They feared that it would disturb the established order of things. In that case it were better to keep aloof, which they did to the tune of some reals. There remained but England, and we know the contemptuous antipathy with which she received Barbicane's proposition. The English, having but one soul for the whole 26 millions of inhabitants which Great Britain contains, they hinted that the enterprise of the Gun Club was contrary to the principle of non-intervention, and they did not subscribe a single farthing. At this intimation the Gun Club merely shrugged its shoulders and returned to its great work. When South America, that is to say, Peru, Chile, Brazil, the provinces of La Plata and Colombia, had poured forth their quota into their hands, the sum of 300,000, it found itself in possession of a considerable capital, of which the following is a statement: United States subscriptions, $4,000,000. Foreign subscriptions, $1,446,675. Total, $5,446,675. Such was the sum which the public poured into the treasury of the Gun Club. Let no one be surprised at the vastness of the amount. The work of casting, boring, masonry, the transport of workmen, their establishment in an almost uninhabited country, the construction of furnaces and workshops, the plant, the powder, the projectile, and incipient expenses would, according to the estimates, absorb nearly the whole. Certain cannon shots in the Federal war cost $1,000 apiece. This one of President Barbicane, unique in the annals of gunnery, might well cost 5,000 times more. On the 20th of October a contract was entered into with the manufactory at Cold Spring, near New York, which during the war had furnished the largest Parrott cast-iron guns. It was stipulated between the contracting parties that the manufactory of Cold Spring should engage to transport to Tampa Town, in southern Florida, the necessary materials for casting the Columbiad. The work was bound to be completed at latest by the 15th of October following, and the cannon delivered in good condition under penalty of a forfeit of $100 a day to the moment when the moon should again present herself under the same conditions, that is to say, in 18 years and 11 days. The engagement of the workmen, their pay, and all the necessary details of the work devolved upon the Cold Spring Company. This contract, executed in duplicate, was signed by Barbicane, president of the Gun Club, of the one part, and T. Murchison, director of the Cold Spring Manufactory, of the other, who thus executed the deed on behalf of their respective principals. Chapter 13. Of From the Earth to the Moon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the Earth to the Moon by Jules Verne. Chapter 13. Stones Hill. When the decision was arrived at by the Gun Club to the disparagement of Texas, everyone in America, where reading is a universal acquirement, set to work to study the geography of Florida. Never before had there been such a sale for works like Bertram's Travels in Florida, Roman's Natural History of East and West Florida, William's Territory of Florida, and Cleland on the Cultivation of the Sugar Cane in Florida. It became necessary to issue fresh editions of these works. Barbicane had something better to do than to read. He desired to see things with his own eyes, and to mark the exact position of the proposed gun. So, without a moment's loss of time, he placed at the disposal of the Cambridge Observatory the funds necessary for the construction of a telescope, and entered into negotiations with the house of Bradwell and Company, of Albany, for the construction of an aluminum projectile of the required size. He then quitted Baltimore, accompanied by J.T. Maston, Major Elphinstone, and the manager of the Cold Spring factory. On the following day the four fellow travelers arrived at New Orleans. There they immediately embarked on board the Tampico, a despatch boat belonging to the Federal Navy, which the government had placed at their disposal, and, getting up steam, the banks of Louisiana speedily disappeared from sight. The passage was long. 2 days after starting, the Tampico, having made 480 miles, came in sight of the coast of Florida. On a nearer approach Barbicane found himself in view of a low, flat country of somewhat barren aspect. After coasting along a series of creeks abounding in lobsters and oysters, the Tampico entered the bay of Espiritu Santo, where she finally anchored in a small natural harbor formed by the embouchure of the river Hillsborough at 7 p.m. on the 22nd of October. Our 4 passengers disembarked at once. "Gentlemen," said Barbicane, "we have no time to lose. Tomorrow we must obtain horses and proceed to reconnoitre the country." Barbicane had scarcely set his foot on shore when 3,000 of the inhabitants of Tampa Town came forth to meet him, an honor due to the president, who had signalized their country by his choice. Declining, however, every kind of ovation, Barbicane ensconced himself in a room of the Franklin Hotel. On the morrow some of the small horses of the Spanish breed, full of vigor and of fire, stood snorting under his windows, but instead of 4 steeds, here were 50, together with their riders. Barbicane descended with his 3 fellow travelers, and much astonished were they all to find themselves in the midst of such a cavalcade. He remarked that every horseman carried a carbine slung across his shoulder and pistols in his holsters. On expressing his surprise at these preparations, he was speedily enlightened by a young Floridian, who quietly said, "Sir, there are Seminoles there." "What do you mean by Seminoles?" "Savages who scour the prairies. We thought it best, therefore, to escort you on your road." "Pooh!" cried J.T. Maston, mounting his steed. "All right," said the Floridian, "but it is true enough, nevertheless." "Gentlemen," answered Barbicane, "I thank you for your kind attention, but it is time to be off." It was 5 a.m. when Barbicane and his party, quitting Tampa Town, made their way along the coast in the direction of Alifia Creek. This little river falls into Hillsborough Bay 12 miles above Tampa Town. Barbicane and his escort coasted along its right bank to the eastward. Soon the waves of the bay disappeared behind a bend of rising ground, and the Floridian champaign alone offered itself to view. Florida, discovered on Palm Sunday in 1512 by Juan Ponce de Leon, was originally named Pascha Florida. It little deserved that designation, with its dry and parched coasts, but after some few miles of tract the nature of the soil gradually changes, and the country shows itself worthy of the name. Cultivated plains soon appear, where are united all the productions of the northern and tropical floras, terminating in prairies abounding with pineapples and yams, tobacco, rice, cotton plants, and sugar canes, which extend beyond reach of sight, flinging their riches broadcast with careless prodigality. Barbicane appeared highly pleased on observing the progressive elevation of the land, and in answer to a question of J.T. Maston replied, "My worthy friend, we cannot do better than sink our Columbiad into these high grounds." "To get nearer the moon, perhaps," said the secretary of the Gun Club. "Not exactly," replied Barbicane, smiling. "Do you not see that among these elevated plateaus we shall have a much easier work of it? No struggles with the water springs, which will save us long expensive tubings, and we shall be working in daylight instead of down a deep and narrow well. Our business, then, is to open our trenches upon the ground some hundreds of yards above the level of the sea." "You are right, sir," struck in Murchison, the engineer, "and if I mistake not, we shall ere long find a suitable spot for our purpose." "I wish we were at the first stroke of the pickaxe," said the president. "And I wish we were at the last," cried J.T. Maston. About 10 a.m. the little band had crossed a dozen miles. To fertile plains succeeded a region of forests, their perfumes of the most varied kinds mingled together in tropical profusion. These almost impenetrable forests were composed of pomegranates, orange trees, citrons, figs, olives, apricots, bananas, huge vines whose blossoms and fruits rivaled each other in color and perfume. Beneath the odorous shade of these magnificent trees fluttered and warbled a little world of brilliantly plumaged birds. J.T. Maston and the Major could not repress their admiration on finding themselves in the presence of the glorious beauties of this wealth of nature. President Barbicane, however, less sensitive to these wonders, was in haste to press forward. The very luxuriance of the country was displeasing to him. They hastened onward, therefore, and were compelled to ford several rivers, not without danger, for they were infested with huge alligators from 15 to 18 feet long. Maston courageously menaced them with his steel hook, but he only succeeded in frightening some pelicans and teal, while tall flamingoes stared stupidly at the party. At length these denizens of the swamps disappeared in their turn. Smaller trees became thinly scattered among less dense thickets. A few isolated groups detached in the midst of endless plains over which ranged herds of startled deer. "At last!" cried Barbicane, rising in his stirrups, "here we are at the region of pines." "Yes, and of savages too," replied the Major. In fact, some Seminoles had just come in sight upon the horizon. They rode violently backward and forward on their fleet horses, brandishing their spears or discharging their guns with a dull report. These hostile demonstrations, however, had no effect upon Barbicane and his companions. They were then occupying the centre of a rocky plain, which the sun scorched with its parching rays. This was formed by a considerable elevation of the soil, which seemed to offer to the members of the Gun Club all the conditions requisite for the construction of their Columbiad. "Halt!" said Barbicane, reining up. "Has this place any local appellation?" "It is called Stones Hill," replied one of the Floridians. Barbicane, without saying a word, dismounted, seizing his instruments, and began to note his position with extreme exactness. The little band, drawn up in the rear, watched his proceedings in profound silence. At this moment the sun passed the meridian. Barbicane, after a few moments, rapidly wrote down the result of his observations, and said, "This spot is well situated 1,800 feet above the level of the sea, in 27 degrees 7 minutes north latitude, and 5 degrees 7 minutes west longitude of the meridian of Washington. It appears to me by its rocky and barren character to offer all the conditions requisite for our experiment. On that plain will be raised our magazines, workshops, furnaces, and workmen's huts, and here, from this very spot," said he, stamping his foot on the summit of Stones Hill, "hence shall our projectile take its flight into the regions of the solar world." Chapter
14 of From the Earth to the Moon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chris Langston, cjlangston.com. From the Earth to the Moon by Jules Verne. Chapter 14. Pickaxe and Trowel. Same evening Barbicane and his companions returned to Tampa Town, and Murchison, the engineer, re-embarked on board the Tampico for New Orleans. His object was to enlist an army of workmen and to collect together the greater part of the materials. The members of the Gun Club remained at Tampa Town for the purpose of setting on foot the preliminary works by the aid of the people of the country. 8 days after its departure, the Tampico returned into the bay of Espiritu Santo with a whole flotilla of steamboats. Murchison had succeeded in assembling together 1,500 artisans. Attracted by the high pay and considerable bounties offered by the Gun Club, he had enlisted a choice legion of stokers, iron founders, lime burners, miners, brickmakers, and artisans of every trade, without distinction of color. As many of these people brought their families with them, their departure resembled a perfect emigration. On the 31st of October, at 10 o'clock in the morning, the troop disembarked on the quays of Tampa Town, and one may imagine the activity which pervaded that little town whose population was thus doubled in a single day. During the first few days, they were busy discharging the cargo brought by the flotilla, the machines and the rations, as well as a large number of huts constructed of iron plates, separately pieced and numbered. At the same period, Barbicane laid the first sleepers of a railway 15 miles in length, intended to unite Stones Hill with Tampa Town. On the 1st of November, Barbicane quitted Tampa Town with a detachment of workmen, and on the following day the whole town of huts was erected around Stones Hill. This they enclosed with palisades, and in respect of energy and activity, it might have been mistaken for one of the great cities of the Union. Everything was placed under a complete system of discipline, and the works were commenced in most perfect order. The nature of the soil having been carefully examined, by means of repeated borings, the work of excavation was fixed for the 4th of November. On that day Barbicane called together his foremen and addressed them as follows. "You are well aware, my friends, of the object with which I have assembled you together in this wild part of Florida. Our business is to construct a cannon measuring 9 feet in its interior diameter, 6 feet thick, and with a stone revetment of 19.5 feet in thickness. We have, therefore, a well of 60 feet in diameter to dig down to a depth of 900 feet. This great work must be completed within 8 months, so that you have 2,543,400 cubic feet of earth to excavate in 255 days. That is to say, in round numbers, 2,000 cubic feet per day. That, which would present no difficulty to 1,000 navvies working in open country, will be of course more troublesome in a comparatively confined space. However, the thing must be done, and I reckon for its accomplishment upon your courage as much as upon your skill." At 8 o'clock the next morning, the first stroke of the pickaxe was struck upon the soil of Florida, and from that moment, that prince of tools was never inactive for one moment in the hands of the excavators. The gangs relieved each other every 3 hours. On the 4th of November, 50 workmen commenced digging, in the very center of the enclosed space on the summit of Stones Hill, a circular hole 60 feet in diameter. The pickaxe first struck upon a kind of black earth, 6 inches in thickness, which was speedily disposed of. To this earth succeeded 2 feet of fine sand, which was carefully laid aside as being valuable for serving the casting of the inner mold. After the sand appeared some compact white clay, resembling the chalk of Great Britain, which extended down to a depth of 4 feet. Then the iron of the pick struck upon the hard bed of the soil, a kind of rock formed of petrified shells, very dry, very solid, and which the picks could with difficulty penetrate. At this point the excavation exhibited a depth of 6.5 feet, and the work of masonry was begun. At the bottom of the excavation they constructed a wheel of oak, a kind of circle strongly bolted together and of immense strength. The center of this wooden disc was hollowed out to a diameter equal to the exterior diameter of the Columbiad. Upon this wheel rested the first layers of the masonry, the stones of which were bound together by hydraulic cement with irresistible tenacity. The workmen, after laying the stones from the circumference to the center, were thus enclosed with a kind of well 21 feet in diameter. When this work was accomplished, the miners resumed their picks and cut away the rock from underneath the wheel itself, taking care to support it as they advanced upon blocks of great thickness. At every 2 feet which the hole gained in depth, they successively withdrew the blocks. The wheel then sank little by little, and with it the massive ring of masonry, on the upper bed of which the masons labored incessantly, always reserving some vent holes to permit the escape of gas during the operation of the casting. This kind of work required on the part of the workmen extreme nicety and minute attention. More than one, in digging underneath the wheel, was dangerously injured by the splinters of the stone. But their ardor never relaxed, night or day. By day they worked under the rays of the scorching sun, by night under the gleam of the electric light. The sounds of the picks against the rock, the bursting of mines, the grinding of the machines, the wreaths of smoke scattered through the air, traced around Stones Hill a circle of terror, which the herds of buffaloes and the war parties of the Seminoles never ventured to pass. Nevertheless, the works advanced regularly, and the steam cranes actively removed the rubbish. Of unexpected obstacles there was little account, and with regard to foreseen difficulties, they were speedily disposed of. At the expiration of the first month, the well had attained the depth assigned for that lapse of time, namely 112 feet. This depth was doubled in December and trebled in January. During the month of February, the workmen had to contend with a sheet of water which made its way right across the outer soil. It became necessary to employ very powerful pumps and compressed air engines to drain it off, so as to close up the orifice from whence it issued, just as one stops a leak on board a ship. They at last succeeded in getting the upper hand of these untoward streams. Only, in consequence of loosening the soil, the wheel partly gave way, and a slight partial settlement ensued. This accident cost the life of several workmen. No fresh occurrence thenceforward arrested the progress of the operation, and on the 10th of June, 20 days before the expiration of the period fixed by Barbicane, the well, lined throughout with its facing of stone, had attained the depth of 900 feet. At the bottom, the masonry rested upon a massive block measuring 30 feet in thickness, while on the upper portion it was level with the surrounding soil. President Barbicane and the members of the gun club warmly congratulated their engineer Murchison. The cyclopean work had been accomplished with extraordinary rapidity. During these 8 months, Barbicane never quitted Stones Hill for a single instant. Keeping ever close by the work of the excavation, he busied himself incessantly with the welfare and health of his workpeople, and was singularly fortunate in warding off the epidemics common to large communities of men, and so disastrous in those regions of the globe which are exposed to the influences of tropical climates. Many workmen, it is true, paid with their lives for the rashness inherent in these dangerous labors. But these mishaps are impossible to be avoided, and they are classed among the details with which the Americans trouble themselves but little. They have in fact more regard for human nature in general than for the individual in particular. Nevertheless, Barbicane professed opposite principles to these, and put them in force at every opportunity. So, thanks to his care, his intelligence, his useful intervention in all difficulties, his prodigious and humane sagacity, the average of accidents did not exceed that of transatlantic countries, noted for their excessive precautions, France, for instance, among others, where they reckon about 1 accident for every 200,000 francs of work. End of chapter 14.